The blizzard was meant to wipe everything clean. Instead, it dragged the past back into the open, with a gun raised. High in the snow-choked Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, a former Navy SEAL believed he had left the war behind. He lived alone, hidden from the world, with only his German shepherd for company. But one night, in the heart of a historic blizzard, that dog pulled him into the storm and straight toward an SUV buried in ice. Inside was a dying lawyer, blood soaking into his suit, clutching a battered leather briefcase like it was his last breath. With fading strength, he whispered a name that should never have resurfaced: Colonel Sterling. What followed was not a rescue, but a hunt. Private mercenaries moved through the blizzard with purpose. Gunfire ripped through pine and frozen air, and when a sniper's bullet found its mark, the dog stepped in front of it. Wounded, hunted, and cut off from the world, the SEAL was forced to fight through the storm using instinct, terrain, and a bond stronger than fear. Inside that briefcase was a truth powerful enough to destroy lives, or finally restore honor. Before we begin, please let us know where you are or how you're feeling, or simply write Amen for all that matters. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable bonds. Your support truly means a great deal to us. Jack Miller didn't leave the teams with a parade or a farewell speech. He left the way men like him often did, quietly, with paperwork signed in a fluorescent hallway, with a firm handshake from someone who didn't know what to say, with a duffel bag that felt too light for the years it carried. The medals were real, sure. The citations, the commendations, the above and beyond language typed by people who hadn't been there. But what followed him home to America wasn't medal. It was the nights. It was the sudden flash of memory in the middle of a grocery aisle. It was the way his right hand sometimes tightened as if it still held a weapon, even when it was empty. It was the way silence could feel like a threat, because silence was never just silence in the places he'd been. It was the way his mind refused to clock out, even when the war was long over. He chose the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana for the same reason he'd once chosen the hardest training blocks, because the environment didn't care about his pain. Snow didn't gossip. Pine trees didn't ask questions. The wind didn't lean in with pity. Up here, the world was simple, in the way survival was simple. Heat mattered, food mattered, time mattered. People did not. Cell service came and went like a bad promise. The nearest town was a thin smear of lights far down the valley, the kind of place where the gas station clerk knew your name after 2 visits and still didn't know your story. Jack liked it that way. His cabin sat tucked between tall, dark pines like a secret someone meant to keep. The logs were old and scarred, the roof heavy with snow after the first storms. Inside, it was clean, spare, and functional. No decorations, no photos, no sentimental clutter. A cast-iron stove squatted in the corner like an anchor, its belly glowing when he fed it split wood. The air always smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap and the cold that clung to his jacket. Jack moved through the space with a disciplined economy, the kind of motion that came from years of learning how to be quiet without trying. He was in his mid-30s, built like someone who still trained even when no one was watching. A square, hard jaw. A short, neatly trimmed beard that never grew wild. A military haircut cut close and practical, the kind you could still feel the clipper lines in. His eyes were the unsettling part. Calm, steady, and too sharp, as if they could pin a lie to the wall and hold it there. People used to call that intensity. Jack knew it for what it was: vigilance that had never found an off switch. He wore the same kind of clothing every day, because it made decisions easy. A former Navy SEAL cold weather outfit built for function, not fashion. A dark tactical jacket with subdued patches, reinforced combat pants, heavy-duty boots meant to bite into ice, gloves that kept dexterity without sacrificing warmth. Everything fit snug, everything moved with him, everything was ready. The jacket smelled like the mountain now, not like the desert, but it still felt like armor. And then there was Cooper. Cooper was a German shepherd, about 6 years old, big and powerful without looking clumsy. Black and tan coat, thick underfur that shrugged off snow like it was nothing. A broad head, intelligent dark eyes, ears that snapped to attention at the slightest sound. Cooper didn't prance. Cooper didn't beg. Cooper watched. The dog had the unmistakable bearing of an animal that had been trained with purpose, obedience, tracking, alert work. Then given a new mission: keep the one human he trusted alive. If Jack's mind was a locked room, Cooper was the only creature that had ever been allowed the key. Some mornings the two of them hiked the ridgelines before sunrise. Jack didn't do it for fitness, though the climb burned and the cold punished weakness. He did it because the mountain forced him to breathe, because moving through snow in the dark kept his senses honest, because the steady crunch of boots and the quiet rhythm of Cooper's paws gave his brain a pattern it could follow without spiraling. Cooper ran wide circles, nose low, checking the world the way Jack checked corners. When Cooper paused, Jack paused. When Cooper's ears pricked, Jack's hand drifted toward the place his weapon would be, even if he wasn't carrying one that day. They were a team in the oldest sense of the word. Two beings reading the same landscape, trusting the same instincts. As Christmas crept closer, the weather turned meaner. The radio in Jack's truck, an old Ford F-150 that rattled like it had lived 3 lives, spit out warnings between bursts of static. A storm system moving in hard from the northwest. A historic event, they called it. Whiteout conditions. Road closures. Stay home. The kind of language that made regular folks stock up on bread and batteries. The kind of language that made Jack check his generator, count his fuel, and stack an extra line of firewood on the porch without thinking twice. He didn't plan to drive anywhere. He didn't plan to see anyone. He had made his peace with the idea of being alone, or at least he'd tried to convince himself that he had. When the world got loud in his head, he preferred it far away from real people. Out here, there was no one to startle with his silence, no one to disappoint with his distance. Out here, if he woke up sweating at 3 a.m. with his pulse hammering and a phantom taste of sand in his mouth, the only witness was a dog who would lift his head, blink once, and settle his weight against Jack's shin as if to say, "You're here, you're not there." That night, the wind began to rise like something alive. It pushed at the cabin walls with long, slow shoves, then hammered the windows in short bursts. Snow hissed across the porch boards. The pines around the cabin groaned and swayed, their branches scraping each other like dull knives. Jack fed the stove until the iron glowed, then checked the locks out of habit more than fear. He set his flashlight on the table, laid his gloves beside it, and listened to the storm build its voice. Cooper stood at the front door. Not lying down, not dozing near the stove. Standing, chest squared, head high, nose angled toward the cracks where cold air slipped in. The dog's ears were rigid, and the muscles along his shoulders had tightened into a hard line. Cooper wasn't reacting to the wind. Cooper knew the difference between weather and something moving through weather. Jack watched him for a long moment, the way he'd once watched a point man at the edge of a doorway. He didn't speak right away. Talking felt unnecessary in the cabin, but he could feel his body shifting gears anyway, the subtle change in breathing, the quiet narrowing of attention. Cooper's tail didn't wag. Cooper's gaze didn't flick toward Jack for reassurance. Cooper was locked on. "What is it?" Jack said finally, voice low, calm, almost flat. Cooper didn't bark. Not yet. He pressed his nose to the seam of the door and inhaled, then exhaled in a soft, controlled huff. Again. A third time. The kind of behavior that said, "I'm reading something you can't see." Jack crossed the room and rested a gloved hand on Cooper's back. The dog's fur was warm from the stove, but the tension under it was electric. Jack felt it like a warning through cloth. Outside, the storm roared, wind, snow, darkness, but threaded through it, faint and wrong, was another sound. Not the creak of trees, not the rattle of loose siding, something mechanical, distant, struggling. An engine? A muffled thump? It was hard to tell, and that uncertainty was what made Jack's spine tighten. The mountain was remote. Nobody came up here in a storm like this unless they were lost, desperate, or chasing something. Cooper's head snapped toward Jack for the first time, eyes bright and urgent. The dog let out a single sharp bark, not random noise, an alert, the way a trained canine signals a change. Cooper pawed at the door once, then again, then turned and looked back as if to demand a decision. Jack didn't hesitate long. He grabbed his jacket even though he was already wearing it, pulled the zipper higher, and tightened his gloves. He clipped a sturdy leash to Cooper's collar, not because Cooper needed it, but because Jack understood the difference between control and chaos. He slipped his flashlight into his hand, checked the batteries without looking, and took one last breath of warm cabin air. When Jack opened the door, the cold hit like a slap. Snow blasted sideways into the entryway. The darkness beyond the porch light was thick and moving, a white curtain snapping and curling in the wind. Cooper leaned forward into the storm with a steady, eager force, dragging Jack one step, then another. Whatever was out there, it had already been close enough for Cooper to smell it through a locked door. And it wasn't the snow. The moment Jack stepped off the porch, the storm swallowed him whole. Snow drove sideways, dense and stinging, erasing depth and distance, until the world collapsed into a narrow tunnel of light from his flashlight. Cooper pulled forward with controlled urgency, muscles coiled, paws cutting a clean line through the drifts. Jack moved with him, boots finding purchase by instinct rather than sight, every sense tuned to the same frequency that had once kept him alive in places where mistakes were fatal and forgiveness didn't exist. They hadn't gone far, maybe 200 yards downslope, when the smell hit first. Hot oil and burned rubber didn't belong up here. Neither did the faint metallic tang that Jack recognized without needing to see it. Blood. Cooper slowed, head dropping, nose sweeping low in quick arcs. The dog angled left, tugging the leash, and Jack followed into a thinning of trees where the ground dipped sharply. The SUV appeared suddenly out of the white-black paint, frosted and scarred, nose down in a shallow ravine as if the mountain had reached out and hooked it by the front axle. One headlight blinked weakly, the other had shattered, its glass buried beneath fresh snow. The engine was still ticking, a tired, irregular sound that said it had fought the cold until it couldn't anymore. Jack killed his light for half a second and listened. No voices, no movement beyond the storm. He turned the beam back on and approached from the uphill side, body angled, eyes scanning the tree line as much as the wreck. Cooper froze. Not fear, assessment. Then the dog released a low, steady whine and stepped forward, ears high, tail rigid. Jack reached the driver's door and saw the man slumped behind the wheel. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a long, narrow face gone pale beneath a day's growth of gray-streaked stubble. Wire-rimmed glasses sat crooked on a sharp nose, one lens cracked. His hair, thinning and iron-colored, was plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cold. A tailored charcoal suit clung to him like it had been put on in a different life. The collar of a white shirt darkened with blood where it seeped from beneath the lapel. The man's right hand trembled against his abdomen, fingers slick and red, while his left arm hugged a battered leather valise tight against his chest, knuckles white with effort. Jack opened the door, and the cold rushed in, merciless. The man gasped, eyes fluttering open, pupils sharp with pain and fear. He looked at Jack as if trying to solve a problem with too little time left. Don't move it," the man said, voice thin and precise, even as it broke. He nodded toward the valise. "Please." Jack didn't answer. He assessed. Seatbelt cut his collarbone. Impact trauma. The angle suggested the man had overcorrected on ice and slid, hard. Jack followed the blood with his eyes and found the source. A deep puncture just under the ribs, likely from a broken rib, driven inward. The kind of wound that killed quietly if you didn't get help fast enough. Jack pressed gloved fingers there and felt warmth and the man's breath hitch. "What's your name?" Jack asked. "Daniel Price," the man said after a second, like he was choosing his words carefully. Attorney. Corporate. Not important. His eyes flicked to Cooper, then back to Jack. You're him. Jack felt the familiar tightening in his gut. Who's him? Price swallowed, blood at the corner of his mouth freezing almost instantly. Jack Miller, Navy SEAL, former. He exhaled a shaky laugh that turned into a cough he couldn't suppress. I didn't know what you looked like. Didn't need to. Jack straightened just enough to let the wind rake across his shoulders. He didn't like being recognized. He liked it even less out here, in a storm, by a stranger who had no business knowing his name. How do you know me? Price's eyes searched Jack's face, lingering on the calm, the posture, the way he stood between the wreck and the darkness without looking like he needed to think about it. Colonel Sterling, he said. The name landed with weight. Jack hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. He felt it echo anyway, down a corridor of memory he kept sealed for good reasons. That's impossible, Jack said quietly. Price shook his head, a small, stubborn motion. Nothing about that operation was impossible. Just buried. His hand tightened on the valise. He sent me. Not tonight. Years ago. I kept, postponing. Another cough. His breath rattled. Cowardice dressed up as caution. Jack glanced back up the slope, the storm tearing the world into pieces. We need to move you. There's no time, Price said, and for the first time his composure cracked. Fear showed then, not wild but measured, the fear of a man who had lived his life in rooms with doors and locks and believed in systems until those systems failed him. Listen to me. They followed. I took back roads, switched vehicles, waited out checkpoints. Didn't matter. Who followed? Jack asked. Price's mouth pulled tight. Men who don't wear badges, don't need warrants. They clean. The word hung between them. Cooper's head snapped toward the trees, ears pivoting. Jack felt it too, not a sound, but a pressure, the sense of something wrong moving closer. He turned back to Price. What's in the bag? Truth, Price said. He forced the valise into Jack's hands with a strength that surprised him. The leather was scuffed, the brass clasps cold and solid. Heavy, but not with cash, paperweight, files, documents, originals, orders that never made it into the official archive, testimony recorded off the books, and a will. His eyes bored into Jack's. Sterling's. Jack didn't open the bag. He didn't need to. He felt the shape of it through the leather, the way a soldier feels the weight of a rifle and knows exactly what it can do. Why me? Price's gaze softened, just a fraction. Because you were the only one who walked away clean and still paid the price. His breathing grew shallow. Because he trusted you to finish it. The wind surged, a sudden roar that bent the pines and erased the wreck in a curtain of white. Cooper growled low, a sound that vibrated through the leash and into Jack's hand. Jack scanned the ridgeline and caught it then, a distant, steady hum beneath the storm. An engine. Not struggling like the SUVs had. Controlled. Moving. Price heard it too. His eyes widened, and urgency burned through the pain. They're close. Take it. Go. Jack leaned in. I'm not leaving you. Price's mouth twitched into something like a smile. You already are. His grip slackened, then tightened once more around Jack's sleeve. Texas, he whispered. That's where it ends. The engine noise grew louder, resolving into more than one source, disciplined and deliberate, cutting through the chaos. Cooper braced, weight forward, teeth flashing in the beam of the flashlight. Jack slipped the valise strap over his shoulder and reached for Price's pulse. It fluttered, weak and fast. Snow thickened, light fractured, and from somewhere up the road, headlights flared, multiple points piercing the whiteout, too steady to be rescue. Jack lifted his gaze to the approaching lights, jaw set, mind already moving. The storm had brought him something he couldn't ignore, and it wasn't done yet. Jack got Daniel Price back to the cabin, but he didn't get him back alive. The man faded somewhere between the ravine and the porch, breath thinning into shallow, useless pulls as the storm pressed harder against the mountain. Jack worked on him anyway, because that was what his hands knew how to do. He laid Price on the cabin floor near the stove, cut away the ruined suit with a hunting knife, packed the wound, tried to slow the bleeding that had already decided its course. Price's skin had gone ashen, the sharp planes of his face more pronounced now, like a sketch stripped of color. His eyes stayed open longer than Jack expected, focused, alert, clinging to the present with stubborn intent. Cooper hovered close but silent, a dark shape against the firelight, muscles tight, head turning toward every sound outside. Snow battered the windows, the generator hummed, steady but fragile, a reminder that even power up here was borrowed, not owned. Price spoke in fragments at first, names without context, dates that meant nothing until they suddenly meant everything. Jack listened, jaw locked, sorting truth from fear by instinct. Then, near the end, the fragments aligned. The operation hadn't gone bad by accident. It had gone bad because it was designed to. The intel that sent Jack's unit into that valley overseas, the one that had ended with civilians dead, allies burned, and blame neatly stapled to his team's file, had been altered, sanitized, redirected. Colonel Sterling had discovered it too late, tried to pull the brake, and found out what happened to men who interfered with profitable lies. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He'd been erased. Price's voice grew weaker as he said it, but his eyes sharpened. "They needed a villain," he whispered. "Your team fit, decorated enough to be believable, disposable enough to bury." Jack felt something old and corrosive shift in his chest. Not rage, not relief, recognition, the kind that confirmed what he'd never allowed himself to say out loud. Price fumbled toward the leather valise with trembling fingers. Jack opened it at last. Inside were neatly bound folders, waterproof sleeves, handwritten notes in a tight, disciplined script Jack recognized instantly. Sterling's hand. There were transcripts of recorded conversations, procurement trails, falsified reports, and at the bottom a sealed envelope bearing Jack's name. A will, executed years ago, clean and legal. Sterling's Texas ranch, land, structures, water rights, left to Jack Miller, not as inheritance in the sentimental sense, but as restitution. "He wanted you to have a place," Price said, barely audible now. "Somewhere no one could rewrite you." Price died a few minutes later, eyes still open, staring into the ceiling beams like he was memorizing them. Jack closed them gently. Outside the storm howled, indifferent. He didn't give himself time to sit with it. He moved because stopping would invite memory, and memory was dangerous when the present was already hostile. Jack wrapped Price's body in a tarp, weighted it down in the unheated shed behind the cabin, a temporary solution for a permanent problem. He would come back to it when there was time for respect, if there was time. Cooper's growl deepened. Jack felt it next, the wrongness in the air. His phone had been useless since he moved up here, but now even the radio hissed into dead silence. The generator's rhythm faltered for half a second, then steadied. Jack checked the control panel and saw the signal lights blinking erratically. Interference, not weather, intentional. He stepped to the window and lifted a corner of the curtain. Down the slope, through the trees, faint shapes moved with purpose. No headlights now, just silhouettes. Men who knew how to use cover, how to disappear between trunks, how to let the storm do the masking. They wore winter tactical gear in muted tones, built for movement and anonymity. Professionals. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose. Mercenaries. Private contractors with clean weapons and dirtier contracts. The kind that didn't knock. He slung the valise across his back and pulled a rifle from the rack by the door, checking it with muscle memory. Cooper took position at his side without command, posture low, eyes tracking motion Jack couldn't yet see. 6 years old, Jack estimated again, prime age for a shepherd. Scar along the left hind leg from training days. Still fast, still lethal when needed. The first shot shattered the night like glass. It punched through the window frame where Jack's head had been seconds earlier, spraying splinters across the room. Cooper lunged, teeth flashing, not toward the shooter but toward the angle of threat, barking once, sharp, directional. Jack rolled, came up on one knee, and fired through the window in controlled pairs. He didn't aim to kill, he aimed to break momentum. Shouts followed, muffled, professional. Orders passed hand to hand. Jack moved through the cabin, extinguishing lights, plunging the space into darkness broken only by the stove's glow. He opened the back door and sent Cooper ahead into the storm, then followed, boots crunching softly over snow. He didn't run downhill. He went up toward the rocks, where sight lines narrowed and angles favored defenders who knew the ground. They circled back through a stand of pines where Jack had cut a game trail the previous winter. He took a knee behind a fallen log and watched two figures advance below, rifles up, movements crisp. One was tall and lean, beard visible beneath his balaclava, eyes scanning with impatience. The other was broader, slower, cautious to the point of paranoia. Experience had taught him that men like the second one were more dangerous. Jack waited until Cooper tensed, then released the leash. The dog moved like a shadow given purpose, silent and fast, slamming into the broader man from the side. The impact, knocked him off balance, his rifle firing wild into the trees. Jack took the shot he'd been waiting for, not center mass, but high shoulder, dropping the second man into the snow with a grunt of pain. The bearded man spun, firing blindly. Jack relocated before the bullets found his last position. Snow exploded around him. Cooper disengaged and returned on command, flank tight, breathing hard but uninjured. More engines roared to life below. Red lights flickered briefly through the trees, infrared, scanning. Jack knew then that staying was no longer an option. The cabin was compromised. The mountain was waking up. He led Cooper higher, into a narrow cut between boulders where the wind screamed loud enough to cover their movement. Behind them, the mercenaries regrouped, voices sharper now, frustrated. Jack paused only once, looking down at the dark shape of his cabin, at the place he'd thought could hold him away from ghosts. He understood the truth at last. The past hadn't followed him here by accident. It had waited, and now that it had found him, it wasn't finished digging. The mountain turned hostile the moment Jack left the last line of trees behind. Wind clawed at his jacket, tearing heat from his body in violent bursts, while snow filled the air so thick it felt solid, as if the storm itself had decided to become terrain. Visibility collapsed to a few yards at best. Sound distorted, swallowed and thrown back in the wrong directions. For men who relied on coordination and communication, this was hell. For Jack, it was an old language he still spoke fluently. He moved uphill at an angle, never straight, forcing pursuit to fracture. Cooper stayed just ahead and slightly downslope, head low, reading the ground with a precision no human eye could match. The German shepherd's black and tan coat was already crusted with ice, breath steaming in sharp bursts. 6 years old, fully grown, power coiled beneath discipline. Cooper wasn't reckless. Every step had intention. When the dog slowed, Jack slowed. When Cooper cut left, Jack followed without question. This wasn't command. This was trust. The first sniper round cracked through the storm with a sound Jack felt more than heard. It split a tree trunk inches from where his head had been a second earlier. Cooper dropped instantly, body flattening into the snow, teeth bared in silent warning. Jack rolled downhill, came up behind a boulder, and pressed his back against cold stone, heart rate already controlled. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. He calculated. The mercenaries were spreading out now, adapting. They were good, not elite, but trained enough to learn fast. Their mistake was assuming numbers mattered more than position. Jack let them believe he was running blind. He doubled back through his own tracks, used the wind to mask movement, and climbed into a narrow saddle where rock walls forced anyone following to funnel through a kill zone. Cooper moved first, ghosting along the ridge, then stopped. His ears angled back, a subtle signal Jack recognized instantly. Threat, elevated. Jack spotted it next, a silhouette above, barely visible against the gray-white sky. a shooter prone on an outcropping, rifle steady, patience born from confidence. Jack waited until the man shifted his weight, just a fraction, then fired once. The shot wasn't fatal, but it shattered the shoulder. The figure rolled out of sight with a scream swallowed by wind. That was when the second sniper found Cooper. The crack came sharper this time, closer. Cooper lunged toward Jack at the exact moment the round tore through the space where Jack's chest had been. The dog slammed into him, hard enough to knock him sideways, and the bullet caught Cooper instead, ripping into the thick muscle of his flank. The impact sent the shepherd tumbling into the snow with a sharp, involuntary yelp. Time narrowed. Jack was at Cooper's side instantly, hands red with blood as soon as he touched the wound. The injury was deep, ugly, bleeding fast. Cooper tried to stand and failed, legs scrambling, eyes wide, not with pain but confusion, as if he couldn't understand why his body wasn't obeying him. Jack felt something crack inside his chest that no bullet had ever reached. "Stay," Jack said, voice low and steady, the way he spoke when everything else was chaos. He pressed hard against the wound, tearing open a compression bandage with his teeth. Snow soaked into his knees. Bullets struck rock nearby, spraying ice and stone. Jack didn't flinch. He wrapped, tied, tightened, every motion deliberate despite the tremor now threatening his hands. Cooper whined once, then went still, trusting completely. Jack lifted his head and saw movement downslope. 2 men advancing, cautious now, rifles raised. One was tall and angular, beard heavy beneath frost, movements aggressive, impatient. The other stayed back, shorter, stockier, eyes darting constantly, a man shaped by bad experiences and worse luck. Jack memorized them in a heartbeat. He stood slowly, placing himself fully between Cooper and the incoming fire. The storm screamed louder, as if urging him on. Jack didn't charge. He retreated just enough to bait them forward, then detonated a small avalanche with a precisely placed shot into an unstable overhang. Snow roared down the slope, a white wall that knocked one mercenary off his feet and forced the other to dive for cover. Jack used the chaos to move, dragging Cooper into a shallow depression shielded by rock. He fired again, disabling, not killing. Survival, not vengeance, was the mission now. Minutes stretched into something timeless. The storm intensified, visibility dropping further, cold gnawing through layers. One by one, the mercenaries fell back or went silent, either wounded, buried, or smart enough to disengage. Jack didn't chase. He knew better than to assume victory too soon. When the wind finally eased, it felt unnatural, like a held breath released. Snow still fell, but gently now, drifting instead of attacking. Jack slumped beside Cooper, exhaustion crashing over him in a wave he hadn't allowed himself to feel until this second. Cooper lifted his head weakly, tongue lolling, eyes still sharp despite the pain. Jack pressed his forehead against the dog's, closing his eyes for the first time since leaving the cabin. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had made peace with that long ago. But the thought of losing Cooper, here, alone, after everything, hit him harder than any memory of war. "Not like this," Jack murmured. "Not you." He fashioned a crude sled from branches and paracord, movement stiff but efficient, and settled Cooper onto it carefully. The dog accepted it without protest, breathing ragged but steady. Jack took one last look at the ridgeline, scanning for pursuit. Nothing. Just mountain and snow and silence. As he began the long, brutal descent toward lower ground, toward a chance, any chance of shelter and care, Jack felt the weight of the valise still strapped to his back. The truth was intact. The evidence hadn't been lost, but the cost was now written in blood and fur and fear. And somewhere beyond the storm, others were already recalculating, realizing the man they'd tried to erase was still moving, still fighting. The storm broke 3 days later, not all at once but in pieces, as if the mountain itself had decided Jack had paid enough. By then, Cooper was alive because Jack refused to let him die. Jack had dragged the sled through the tree line until his legs shook and his vision tunneled, had flagged down a snowplow on a county road that hadn't seen traffic since before Christmas. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray mustache frozen stiff with ice, didn't ask questions. He took one look at the blood, the dog, the man's eyes, and radioed for help with the kind of urgency reserved for things you don't want to explain later. The veterinary clinic in Hamilton was small and overworked, staffed by people who knew ranch injuries and winter accidents better than paperwork. Dr. Emily Ross was in her early 40s, tall and lean, hair pulled into a messy auburn knot, freckles sharp against pale skin that never saw enough sun. Her voice was calm, practical, and carried the weight of someone who had learned not to promise outcomes she couldn't guarantee. She worked on Cooper for hours, extracting fragments, stitching muscle, stabilizing shock. Jack didn't leave the exam room. He stood against the wall like a sentry, hands clenched and unclenched, until she finally turned and nodded once. "He's strong," she said. "So are you." That helped. Jack nodded back, because words felt unnecessary and dangerous. He didn't stay in Montana long after that. Not because he was afraid, but because the mountain had already given him everything it was going to. He made one call from a borrowed phone, then another. He waited. The federal agents arrived quietly, without sirens or ceremony. Two of them stepped out of an unmarked SUV at the edge of town. The first was Special Agent Mark Alvarez, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, dark hair cut short, face lined by years of bureaucracy and disappointment. His eyes were sharp but tired, the eyes of a man who had learned how often the truth died in conference rooms. The second was Special Agent Claire Whitman, early 30s, pale blonde hair tucked under a knit cap, posture rigid, jaw set with the intensity of someone still angry enough to do something about it. She listened more than she spoke. Jack handed over the valise without ceremony. They didn't argue about jurisdiction. They didn't question his involvement. Alvarez opened the bag, leafed through the documents, and went very still. Whitman read over his shoulder, breath hitching just once before she mastered herself. "This is clean," Alvarez said quietly. "Painfully clean." "It was meant to be," Jack replied. The investigation moved fast after that, not because the system was noble, but because exposure had teeth. Names surfaced, contracts unraveled. The men who had chased Jack into the storm vanished back into the legal gray they'd crawled out of, protected until they weren't. Sterling's record was reopened, amended, restored. His reputation returned not with applause, but with silence, the kind reserved for men who had been right too early and paid for it. Jack's name was scrubbed where it mattered. The shadow lifted, not dramatically but thoroughly. No apology arrived in the mail. No commendation ceremony followed. Jack hadn't expected one. He patched the Ford F-150 himself in a borrowed barn, hands moving with the same methodical patience he'd once used to clean weapons. The truck was old, dark paint dulled by years of sun and neglect, engine temperamental but honest. It suited him. Cooper rode in the passenger seat when they left, bandaged, cone removed, eyes alert again. He was thinner now, scarred but alive. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck at every stop, grounding himself in the reality of warm fur and steady breath. They drove south. The land changed slowly at first, snow thinning, trees giving way to open sky. Then faster, mountains flattened into plains. The air warmed. Jack slept in the truck some nights, in cheap motels others. No one followed. No one asked questions. The road became what it had always promised to be, movement without pursuit. Texas greeted them with space. The ranch sat outside a small town that had learned how to mind its business generations ago. Fences stretched toward the horizon, broken only by mesquite and scrub. The house was weathered but solid, white paint peeling, porch sagging just enough to tell the truth about its age. Inside, the rooms were empty but for dust and light. Jack stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the absence of noise. No wind screaming, no gunfire echoing in his head. Just quiet. He buried Daniel Price at the edge of the property beneath an old oak, marking the grave with a simple stone. He did the same for Sterling later, when the paperwork allowed it, when the truth was no longer a liability. There was no speech, just acknowledgement. Mornings came easier here. Jack rose with the sun, fed Cooper, walked the land. He fixed fences. He learned the rhythm of the place. Some nights the memories came anyway. He didn't fight them as hard. He didn't have to. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple, Jack sat on the porch with Cooper at his feet, the dog's scar catching the light like a reminder that survival always costs something. Jack watched the horizon and felt, for the first time in years, that he wasn't waiting for the next thing to go wrong. He wasn't redeemed. He wasn't healed. But he was free, and this time the road behind him stayed quiet.